Continuing on with the TMCC Library Open Genealogy Lab Outstanding Guest Speaker Series, today we are pleased to present Loren Pospisil. Loren grew up in Fort Pierre, South Dakota on the Missouri River. In his imagination, he had a front row view of Lewis and Clark and the upper Missouri fur trade going up and down the mighty Mo. He majored in history at Dakota State College, graduating in 1985, and in 1986, he came to a census and moved to Nebraska. He went to Fort Robinson for 7 years and has been the site supervisor at Chimney Rock since 1994. He believes in the human side of history and sees the Oregon Trail as a living thing that is still with us today. So I'd like to offer a warm virtual welcome to Loren.
Okay, well, thank you. Today I'm going to talk about, we're going to do two things. I'm going to do a slideshow of some sites along the Oregon Trail here in western Nebraska and Wyoming. When I use the term Oregon Trail, I'm speaking generically. We had people going through Nebraska onto Utah, Nevada, Oregon, California, Montana, all parts west. The Platte River Road was a major travel corridor for parts west, but I'm going to use the term Oregon Trail as a generic thing. And then after that, after the slideshow, I'm going to talk about some documents. I've collected about 4,000 primary documents of people that were involved with the Platte River Road. I see people on the trail as being alive because I'm reading their documents, I'm reading their diaries, I'm reading their recollections, and they're alive when they do those things. So that's really how I see the people. And I've collected thousands of them, so I'm going to share with you some ideas and ways to steal information from the internet after I do the slideshow here. So here's a map of the Oregon Trail, and this, of course, comes from the Oregon Trail game. It's actually a fairly accurate map, but here's a modern one with the line on it. We look at the Oregon Trail, or call the Oregon Trail, but like I said, there's people going right through your area there in Nevada, if that's where you are, onto California, up into the Pacific Northwest, also going to Montana, Idaho. A huge number of people coming through here were Mormons going on to Utah. There was also traffic on both sides of the river and in both directions. Often we think of the Oregon Trail as being a westward migration, but there are huge numbers of people going east, especially with after the Mormons settled in Utah. So we're going to talk about some of the sites. Back up 1 second here. The area I'm going to talk about today is basically the panhandle of Nebraska and the first little part of Wyoming there. We have a wonderful segment of the Oregon Trail here with a lot of sites that are within about a 200-300 mile span where you can really see and feel and learn about the trail itself. And a lot of places are still you can see remnants of the trail, see great museums, and really get a good experience from California Hill near Brule to Guernsey, Wyoming is a great travel corridor that you can just put together as a vacation package. So those are the sites I'm going to talk about today. As you leave the interstate, or today's interstate, leave the Platte River, you're going to go over what's called California Hill. You're going to leave the Platte Valley and go up into the high country. And this is remnants of the trail going up on California Hill. They had to go up quite a ways. Here's another good picture of from the parking area at the top of California Hill. So you can see they've had to, the Platte River is clear off in the distance there. So they've had to come up quite a ways with their wagon. And then they still have a pretty good hill to climb with we have the ruts remaining then on the right. And then they cross over the top, and then they have to come back down into the North Platte Valley. Because before where they were going up to California Hill, they were coming down the South Platte. Here's a beautiful aerial view of the trail. To the right is the modern day highway, but to the left on the top of the ridge is a wonderful segment of trail remnants. We often call them ruts or swales, but that's a good chunk of swales there. And almost all of those swales there are on private property. Sometimes we think of the government as being the entity that protects land, but the best protection of natural resources is a landowner that cares about the land. And in Nebraska, we're lucky to have a lot of people like that. So that's the actual Oregon Trail then going along that ridge there. The far knoll, or not far knoll, but sort of in the center and left of the picture, there's a little knoll. That's going to be what's called Windlass Hill. And we're going to look at that in a second here. That little knoll where the trail ends is owned by the Game and Parks Commission, but the rest of that is privately held. And so I'm proud of our private landowners. But coming down Windlass Hill, this is a remnant of the trail there. Sometimes it's hard to say or tell because there might have been erosion since then, but that way people had to bring wagons down off of that hill. It's often called Windlass Hill, even though they probably never used a windlass, but they would have to lock their wagons, lock their wheels with axles or poles to keep them from rolling down out of control. Here's the bottom of Windlass Hill, so you can see how steep that hill is, having to come down off of it. As you get down into the Ash Hollow there, Ash Hollow is wonderful because throughout a lot of Nebraska in the 1840s and 50s, there were no trees. Well, Ash Hollow had wonderful springs and wonderful trees, so it was a wonderful place for people to stop and take a break. Here's a good picture overlooking the Platte Valley from where Game and Parks has their museum there. Today, you see a whole bunch of trees down in the Platte Valley. There were no trees in 1840, 1850, 1860. There were no trees down in that area. At the bottom there is a grave. Rachel Pattison died in 1849. You can visit her grave. There's a local cemetery there, the modern day cemetery, but her grave is there. There's 8 named graves in Nebraska out of the thousands of people that died. Most of the graves were subsequently lost. And even of the graves that we know there was a grave there, very often we don't have the name. But here we have Rachel Pattison was buried there at Ash Hollow. Just outside of Ash Hollow is another grave, A. Kelly. We don't know if A. Kelly was male or female. In fact, the grave is almost, the stone is not possible to see because it's flat on the ground. But a marker was put up in the early 1900s, 1913, that shows where it was. That's on private property and it's not something you're liable to see as you travel. And then as you get closer going west, there's another grave, John Holman, which is near Oshkosh. This is the marker that people see on the road. Sometimes people don't know that his grave is pretty accessible down the county road about 1/10 of a mile away. But it's easy to miss because of the very, very small stone. But the locals have put up a fence around it. So that is a visitable grave. As they're going along, there's 2 types of chairs. People traveling on both the south side and the north side of the river. Often we call the road on the south side the Oregon Trail and the north side the Mormon Trail, even though more non-Mormons run the north side than Mormons. But sometimes sites on the north side get short shrift because, well, it's not what they call the Oregon Trail. But as the Mormons were going through in 1847, they very much documented these sites on the north side of the river. So this is what was called ancient bluff ruins. And I think they're picturesque as well, but they just don't get near the ink or nor the photographic exposure that rocks on the south side get. But they were important on the north side of the trail. As you get closer to Bridgeport, there's another grave, Amanda Lamb, or Lamb. We don't know what her name was. It was either Lamb or Lamb. Her grave is also on private property and there's no access to it. But as near Bridgeport, Nebraska is Courthouse and Jail Rock. Courthouse and Jail Rock are the first of the big rocks they're seeing if you're on the south side of the river. Courthouse and Jail Rock, some immigrants called it the Solitary Tower, which always confused me because there's 2 of them. But Courthouse and Jail Rock is the furthest east portion of the Wildcat Ridge. So they're sort of separated by themselves. And as you go further west, you'll see the Wildcat Ridge develop. This is a view of Courthouse and Jail Rock from the north viewing south. Here's a close-up view. And here's a wonderful view from the south going north. Not a lot of people on the Oregon-California trails would be looking at this view, but in the 1860s, there was a road from Sydney to the Black Hills, and they would be seeing Courthouse and Jail Rock from this view. And here's Chimney Rock. This is what Chimney Rock looked like in 1848. It looks a lot different today. Here's a painting by William Henry Jackson. William Henry Jackson went west in the 1860s as a freighter and then became a photographer and a world-class photographer and well known for it. Later in his 90s, he started painting scenes from the trail. So we owe a great deal of our imagery to William Henry Jackson. Now, this is a famous image called Approaching Chimney Rock. Here's another image I like of Chimney Rock. This is by Bierstadt, a Native American village before Chimney Rock. I love this. There's so much information in this drawing here. People and horses, and they've got activities and things to do, and dogs. There's a tremendous amount of dogs with Native American groups. Anymore, I'm spending a lot of time thinking about Native American participants in this story. Way too often, we've looked at this story and thought of Native Americans as background. I think that's unfortunate. They're very much our participants in this story. And while Native American tribes might be victims of history, as individuals, I don't see them as victims of history. I see them as individuals being participants of history, and their story and the things that happened in this story is very important as well. So I love this image for a lot of reasons, and this is an image that I spend a lot of time studying. Ezra Meeker is the man in the foreground. Ezra Meeker was a young man in 1850. He was 20 years old. He and his young bride went from Indiana to the Pacific Northwest. Ezra had a long series of adventures. He grew hops and wrote the book Hop Culture in America. Made a fortune, lost a fortune, went into business, lost his businesses, went to the Yukon Gold Rush for trade. Later, as an old man, he was upset that people didn't care about the history. So in 1905, 1912, 1920s, he recrossed the trail again, promoting the history. So here in 1905, we've got him here at Chimney Rock again, 50 years after he went the first time. Here's a modern day image of Chimney Rock. So Chimney Rock is a little bit shorter than when immigrants were seeing it back in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, but it still is quite stunning. Another rock that's west of us that gets short shrift by historians and people today is Castle Rock. Castle Rock is very picturesque. Unfortunately, it's on private property. There's no public access. The best view is from the highway, and very often the sun is against you, so you don't really get very many good pictures of Castle Rock. But it was a majestic rock on the trail to Oregon as well. Before Scottsbluff, you get to Scottsbluff, Rebecca Winters, in 1852, she is on the north side of the river. She's a Mormon. She dies in 1852. She's buried. And then later, the railroad plants the grade right near her grave. I mean, just feet away from her grave. Because it's so close to this, the railroad, and the access was from the road, which was to your right. The railroad wanted either to close it off or to move it. Well, in 2004, it was decided to move her grave to the north side of the railroad tracks where people would have access. So this is her grave today. But her grave is visited by thousands of people. The original part of her grave, and the reason her grave survived, is someone had took a wagon wheel and scratched her name on it, heated it, and bent it into a big oval, so it got buried into the ground quite a distance. Thousands of graves were lost, but because someone used a wagon tire to mark hers, it survived. Here's a good map of the area here from Bridgeport past Scotts Bluff. I want you to look at the part to the left here because this will explain what's going on. The road going to the south goes through what's called Rubidoux Pass and later through Mitchell Pass. In the 1840s, the immigrants were going through what's called Rubidoux Pass, which was to the south. Mitchell Pass was not passable in the 1840s. Around 1850, someone did some road work, and then they was able to get through Mitchell Pass. And that's where Scottsbluff National Monument is today. When Mitchell Pass opened up, they thought it was a great shortcut, but when you do the math, that's about the same as the road through Rubidoux Pass anyway. But Rubidoux Pass is very picturesque. Here's a picture from the pass looking back through the area. To the left is the Scottsbluff area, and straight in the center there is Castle Rock. You can't quite see Chimney Rock in this picture, but it's going to be a straight line then from Castle Rock. This is just a wonderful picture that shows the wide open areas today. Even though there are quite a few people living in the country today, you can still see wonderful images of this without a lot of people, and you can really let your imagination go and see what you think the immigrants might have been seeing. There are graves at Rubidoux Pass. These graves are not named, but they did survive. Nearby there is another grave known as Dunn, Fleming Dunn, and that's a known grave as well. That's a cement marker, that's not an original marker. But we do have graves to see in the area. I said there's 8 named graves in Nebraska. 6 of them are in the Panhandle here. So going through Rubidoux Pass, Antoine Rubidoux had a trading post there. Immigrants found it very popular. It was one of the first only places they were able to find what they called civilization. Later, he moved his trading post south of there to a place called Carter Canyon. This is a reproduction of his trading post, and this is now gone. The rock behind is an interesting rock that was actually painted by a fellow by the name of Mulhausen, and that's the only image we have of it. Unfortunately, that painting was destroyed by bombing in World War II over in Europe. Here's a wonderful image of Scottsbluff National Monument across the river. You can't see it from here. The reason they didn't go between the rock and the river is that it's really broken up territory there and not suitable for wagons. But this is a picture. Mitchell Pass is off to our left. After the 1850s, they started going through Mitchell Pass here. That's called Eagle Rock. Here in the foreground, you see a Conestoga wagon. There probably weren't any Conestoga wagons on the Oregon Trail, but this makes for a wonderful picture. Those oxen aren't real, but it makes for a wonderful picture. Here's from the top of Scottsbluff, looking at the road. You can drive to the top of Scottsbluff Monument. In the 1930s, the Civilian Conservation Corps built a road that goes to the top. So if you visit our area here, you can see these wonderful places. Also go to the top of Scottsbluff. It's just a wonderful sight. Carrying on into Wyoming, probably the most one of the major landmarks on the trail would be Fort Laramie. This is an aerial view of Fort Laramie. I don't know if immigrants had drones, so this is definitely a modern picture, but showing the parade ground. A lot of what we see at Fort Laramie is 1870s structures, but there are some 1840s buildings remaining. Old Bedlam and the trading post remains from the 40s. Here's just a fun map of Fort Laramie from 1867. So this is going to be kind of what immigrants were seeing there. Not all of this stuff would have been there in the 40s or 50s. The fort started to expand in the 60s and then again in the 70s. But here's the trading post at Fort Laramie and a wagon out in front. This would have been one of the very few places that immigrants were able to buy food and supplies. The Rubidoux trading post and this one. Prices were often very expensive. Sometimes you weren't able to get the stuff you might want, and if you did get it, it was very expensive because they were limited there. The trading post there was set up originally for the fur trade and then later the military. So sometimes immigrants could really wipe them out on stuff. Carrying on into Wyoming is Register Cliff. Immigrants wrote their names on everywhere they could. They scratched their names on Courthouse Rock, Chimney Rock, Scotts Bluff. To our knowledge, the names have been eroded away from Chimney Rock. I've not seen anything original on Chimney Rock, but there are original engravings on Register Cliff. You get further into Wyoming and everyone's familiar with Independence Rock. Independence Rock was granite, so you carve into that and that's going to last a long time. But this is sedimentary stuff, so it's really wonderful that this was able to survive these carvings into the soft sandstone and siltstone rock at Register Cliff. You're also at Guernsey is the famous ruts at Guernsey, the deep ruts. I don't know, just about every day I'll get people saying, when we were a kid, we saw traces of the Oregon Trail carved through the rock. These are the famous remnants of the trail that everyone seems to remember. More often than not, what you see for remnants of the trail are low, shallow swales or ruts, like I showed you the picture before. But at Guernsey, they went through the rock or went across the rock, and the wagon wheels actually carved a trail through the rock. And these are now quite famous because of that. Very famous, very picturesque, even though they're probably not very common as far as trail remnants go. More trail remnants are just going to be a rut type structure like what we saw earlier above Ash Hollow. But there's another picture of the trail at Register Cliff. So that's the slideshow of the sites I've got. I guess I can answer a few questions right now before I go into the document part.
Okay, class, any questions for our guest speaker at this point?
Hi, Dave Perdue here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Two questions. The wagon wheels, the steel wheels, did they make it all the way across, or did they have to be, it probably had to be repaired, but did they make it all the way across?
A couple of things were happening with their wagons. They were buying very, very good wagons in Missouri, but in Missouri it rains, and they come across Nebraska and things start to dry out, and especially when you get to Wyoming. And for those of you in Nevada, you're a lot drier even than we are. So the wood, although well seasoned and well done, as it goes west, the wood shrinks. And it doesn't take very much to shrink. And a tight fitting wagon wheel, the wheel is going to be made out of wood, and then the rim or the tire is going to be made out of metal. Well, it doesn't take that wood very much to shrink at all. And all of a sudden the rims come off of the tire. And you'd have other problems too. So sometimes you'd have to redo these tires. You might want good places at Fort Kearney or Fort Leaven or Fort Laramie. There was also a blacksmith shop at Rubidoux Trading Post. Sometimes you take advantage of those places, and you take the tire, the metal part, like we saw Rebecca Winter's grave. You'd heat it up, take it off of the tire wheel, take a piece out of it and re-weld it back together and fit it back onto the tire to make it smaller. So you frequently had to do some wagon work on your wagons along the way. The axles would often break, the tongues would often break. Sometimes people had spares, sometimes they didn't. They would have to make new ones. You get further west, especially this is a problem in Nevada. When you get into the Humboldt, you'll start to have animals start to weaken and die on you. Sometimes people would cut their wagons in half and make carts out of them. A lot of wagons did make it all the way west, but a lot of them were abandoned on the road. A lot of them were recobbled back together. I don't know how many modern wagon wheels or wagons remain, but a lot of them then, if they survived and were abandoned, were then subsequently used by later settlement. So finding original ones might be kind of rare. A good place to see original wagons is in the movie The Way West, a 1923 silent movie. And they actually used wagons that had made it all the way to California. That's just a useless piece of trivia.
Great answer. Just a comment on your map. When you get to Nevada, there were actually 3 routes, one north through Butte County, one south through Carson City, Placerville, and the one you show was, I believe, a little bit later route.
Yes,
Thank you.
Right. I've been to Nevada twice. Nevada is amazing. I was amazed at how dry it was, and I like to think we're dry here in western Nebraska, but it was really dry. Nevada also has more mountain ranges than any other state. So we think of Nebraska as being a problem to get across. Actually, Nebraska was the easy part of the route. Your animals were fresh, you had good water, you had good grass. You get into Wyoming, northern Utah, Nevada, things got really challenging there. And sometimes people knew where they were going, sometimes they didn't. The Donners had read the wrong guidebook, and they got took a detour that did not help them there in Nevada. So you had a problem then too. So you survived Nevada, and then you get to the mountains, the Sierra Nevada mountains, and it can snow there early, and you get into problems. So there's a whole part of the world out there that can just really be rough on you. And routes are really important too. I showed you a really simplistic map of the trail. People were jumping off from a lot of different places, so we can talk about it in this map too. Down here you see Fort Leavenworth and Atchison. Fort Leavenworth is kind of close. Independence is south of that. Further up north, you've got Nebraska City. Further up north, you got Plattsmouth. It's not on this map, but Plattsmouth and then Omaha are also jumping off places on the trail. And sometimes we just think of Independence as being the jumping off place, but people were jumping off from several places along the Missouri River and then coming across Kansas or Nebraska. So you get to Nebraska, or a lot of these routes would come to Nebraska and sort of join up just east of Fort Kearney, which is going to be about where the N and the E are here. And so then from Fort Kearney throughout western Nebraska and the first half of Wyoming, you have one big major trunk route that people are going, but then also people also went into northeastern Colorado too. So there were multiple routes involved with what's going here. The Great Platte River Road was the main group, but when you get out further west, when you start to get into western Wyoming, there's several opportunities for you to go in different directions. So the trail is not a word I usually use, but here we sort of condensed it for quickness sake. But there's dozens of little jumping off places in eastern Nebraska along the Nebraska coast, so to speak. So here on, yes.
One real quick comment, if I may add. My ancestors came up the Cherokee Trail of Texas up through Colorado to Fort Bridger, so there were other trails that
what were their names?
Well,
what were their names?
Duncan.
I don't know the name. There was a historian, Pat Fletcher. They wrote a book on the Cherokee Trail. The Cherokee Trail very often hooked up with the Platte River. In the first group of Mormons that went west across Nebraska, there was also another group that took the Cherokee Trail and joined up with them. And sometimes their story is lost in the big story. But Colorado also had huge amounts of trails going in every which direction, as well as Utah as well. So sometimes, well, I can get bogged down on this rabbit hole. But looking at this map too, sometimes tourists will come out and look at me and they'll say, boy, you're in the middle of nowhere. But actually, I tell them that we're in the middle of everywhere, because before Nebraska was flyover country, it was drive-through country. And Nebraska was kind of right smack dab in the middle of anywhere anybody ever wanted to go. So if you wanted to do a coast-to-coast travel, very often you were dealing with Nebraska. So in addition to the Oregon, Mormon, and California trails crossing Nebraska, you also had the Pony Express, the Telegraph, the Transcontinental Railroad. The first telephone lines went across Nebraska. The Lincoln Highway went across Nebraska. The first transcontinental airmail route crossed Nebraska. Nebraska was the first state to complete its interstate, I-80. Nebraska also was the first fiber optic phone lines went across Nebraska. The 80% of the produce from California agriculture fields to New York and area comes through Nebraska. The interstate today is the busiest rural interstate in the country. So Nebraska, the history of Nebraska is really a history of transportation, connecting the east and west coasts. So Nebraska is right in the center of things. So we are, I tell people, in the center of everywhere. I said earlier that I think I look at the people that were involved with the Oregon, Mormon, and California trails as being alive. That's because I read a lot of their documents, a lot of the letters that they left. There's a lot of different types of information that people left. People would leave diaries, recollections, letters, journals, reminiscences later in life. Diaries are very often written for their own personal use, and sometimes they have personal things. A journal was often written with the idea of maybe publishing it someday. The guidebooks, recollections would happen later in life. People would send letters home. Letters home often had very good information. And recollections later in life. Sometimes recollections later in life can have problems. And we're going to talk about some of those things here as we go about. I'm also going to talk about ways that I've stolen information from the interweb. A great place to steal information is from advanced book search on Google. And Google might be evil if you ask me on any other day, but with advanced book search, I really love, because they'll have thousands and thousands of documents online that you can find a tremendous amount of information. I know all y'all collect a lot of information being interested in genealogy, so maybe I'm not telling you anything new, but I'm going to tell you how I've collected a lot of stuff. I've collected about 4,000 primary documents or copies of primary documents, and a lot of the stuff I stole from the interwebs. And Google Advanced Book Search is a good thing to use. And if you just type advanced book search, it'll come up in your search engine. So you'll get a screen that looks like this, and there's different things you can put in. Very often I'll put in for exact phrase, like up at the top there, Chimney Rock. Chimney Rock, you can also get a lot of other things too. So sometimes you have to add some other search words, because there's 37 different states have a Chimney Rock, and some of them are also pretty famous as well. So I found that I can get good trail documents by putting in Chimney Rock and also the word oxen, or maybe Platte River, or I might use Fort Laramie. And also I wanted to click the box that says full view only, because full view only will really find me some good information. So just clicking on Chimney Rock and full view only, yesterday I did this and found dozens and dozens of primary documents dealing with the trail. And the first one, 10 pictures of the garden end of the world, or Santa Clara County. Huge numbers, especially in the 1880s, there were, and you've seen these being in genealogy, you get these history and pioneer peoples, famous peoples, and they'd have little short biographies of these people. And California, Oregon, Wyoming, Montana, every state had dozens of these. And sometimes they have really good information in them. Sometimes it's information that's going to fly under the radar of a lot of other historians. So I went to pen pictures, that first one, and found a good document that's too small to read here, but there's a good document about Chimney Rock and later oxen. And this person talking about some experiences on the trail. And then if you pick full view only, you're able to download the PDF. And so you can use it on your own computer as you wish. And that's a lot of fun there. So going back to pick another one, I just picked another one, genealogy of the Kaufman families. The first one, you just click the download button. If you go click another one, sometimes those biographies will be edited, or sometimes they're going to be the person's words that have been changed and rewritten, but sometimes it's a primary document too. Like here's a letter, and so right off the top it says, "We crossed the Missouri River on the 1st of June," and later at Chimney Rock. So I know that not only is this someone's story, it's also a primary document rather than something that was rewritten. So when I went to go download this, since it was the second document I'm downloading, it asked me to prove I was a real person. So you just type in those numbers, and then you'll download your PDF. So this is a good way to collect hundreds and hundreds of documents dealing with the trail. And you can put in any sort of search words you want. You can put in your town. I was interested in Oregon Trail stuff, so I'm using words like oxen and Chimney Rock and Fort Laramie. But if you're doing the history of Winnemucca, Nevada, you can put in terms that are going to apply to your community and get documents from a different time period. Google Documents is putting on things. These books and documents are going to be 75 years old because they've fallen into the public domain. So the advantage of that is you're finding a lot of good old stuff that you might not be aware of. But it's also going to come with its own problems, and we'll talk about that later too. But it is a wonderful way to collect a lot of good documents, a lot of them primary. And so this was that last one that I picked on, and there's just tremendous amount of information here up at the top. This is a guy's letter, so it was included in this. We then passed many graves. Amongst them, I saw Abraham Adams' Adams' grave at Chimney Rock. It is no use to tell you the number of persons that died from the Missouri River to Fort Laramie on the north side of the river. So here's just in one short paragraph, I'm collecting a lot of information. First of all, there's another man. He mentions a person by the name of Davis. So here's two names. I've picked up Abraham Adams, also picked up a name of Davis. So you can assign these people to a year. You can also assign them to a place. So there's a huge amount of information. He also mentions being on the north side of the river. So just in a really short paragraph, I'm picking up all sorts of information. And later he's talking about the cost of flour at Fort Laramie, the expensive. Later he's talking about Native Americans and grass being scarce. So going on to Fort Boise, they found nothing but tobacco. So here in a short letter is a tremendous amount of information that I can then use when I'm talking to the public about life on the trail. Sometimes, however, you do have to be careful with documents that you're going to find. This one is Jasper Twitchell, and he was in the history of San Mateo, Monterey, San Benito, Santa Cruz, and San Mateo counties, published in the 1880s. Jasper Twitchell went to California. I liked his story a lot. This was a story that he probably told to someone, and then they rewrote it to use in their book. So it, whether you call it a primary document or I call it a secondary document that's primary, it might not make any sense, but still, I got a real person on the trail and I like him. I liked his story. I also liked a quote that was in his story, and I use this quote a lot. Mr. Twitchell's wife died while on the way at a place called Chimney Rock. If anything would try a man's soul, it is to bury the companion of his life in the Wild West. I really liked that quote. I used it a lot because it really symbolized the number of people that had to leave someone on the plains, leave someone near Chimney Rock, and maybe never even to find their grave ever again because so many graves were lost. So this is a life-changing experience that the trail changed these people's world. So I really loved this quote. Well, one day I decided to find out some more information about Mr. Twitchell because what was there was just pretty scant. So I just did a search and I went to Find a Grave, and a lot of you have been to Find a Grave. Went to Find a Grave, and there was his obituary. And in obituary, it said that he's a lifelong Mormon. And all of a sudden, a big light bulb went off in my brain when I say Mormon, because the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has got thousands of primary documents online and thousands of names online. I had associated Jasper Twitchell with California because I found him in a California book of biography. But since he was Mormon, he came over with the Mormons. And by going to the Mormon Pioneer database, I was able to find his name. Did this search in this page, and lo and behold, a page came up there with Jasper Twitchell. Scrolling down on that page, they had sources down at the bottom that talked about him and where you get more information. So from the William Burton Journal, who was the journalist, the Mormon wagon trains often had an official journalist, not always, but often, had an official journalist that documented what was going on in that company. So I went and found that, and I was so excited to find that. I went and found that, and lo and behold, there's the William Burton's entire journal for the trail that you can go ahead and reread. So going down into that, I find out Friday, this is July 14th, Friday morning, a sister by the name of Twitchell died with consumption and was buried at the foot of the Bluff Ruins. Now, the Bluff Ruins is ancient Bluff Ruins that I showed you before. Ancient Bluff Ruins is about 37 miles from Chimney Rock. So at this point, I'm looking at Jasper Twitchell saying that he buried his wife at Chimney Rock, but lo and behold, here it says that she's buried at Bluff Ruins. And then I go down, go forward 3 more days here, July. No, I lost it. President Young, Monday the 17th. Oh yeah, Monday the 17th, we had 72 wagons in our company. We traveled about 10 miles, crossed the river 4 miles above Chimney Rock. So here I learned a couple of things from this document, putting the two documents together. Jasper, remembering that he buried his wife at Chimney Rock, but clearly wasn't at Chimney Rock. So that tells me that, 40 years later, this person is remembering events from his life, but 40 years later, some of the details are getting lost in the gray matter. So he doesn't remember 40 years later ancient bluff ruins, but he does remember Chimney Rock. And that goes to how important Chimney Rock is as a landmark, not just on the trail, but in our minds and in our memories of the history of things. So he's associating this with Chimney Rock. Also, just lo and behold, here we associate the north side of the river, called the Mormon Trail, but here they crossed the Platte River just above Chimney Rock. And normally you wouldn't cross the river unless you had to, so there's a reason they crossed the river. Also, a lot of hand carts were crossing the river sort of after North Platte. So here, by looking at details, you're able to find a lot of details in this primary document, but by putting it together with other documents, you're also able to put together a story that's bigger than the details, and a story that goes to how we remember our history as well. So going quickly, other things, a wonderful place. The Library of Congress has a tremendous amount of stuff online. And so here, Library of Congress, I find out that Chimney Rock is in Utah, because here's the famous Frederick Piercy drawing of Chimney Rock, although they listed as Utah. So you do have to be careful what you're finding here. But here you can find a wonderful copy of Frederick Piercy's drawing of Chimney Rock. They call Chimney Rock Utah there because Frederick Piercy ended up in Utah. So that's how they connected it. Library of Congress also did in the 1930s the Federal Writers Project. The Federal Writers Project did a lot of things. Things of interest to me is that they went and interviewed pioneers and old timers, people who were settling in California, Oregon, Montana, Wyoming, talking about their life stories. And there's a lot of small little snippets of trail life then in their stories. And so you might have to read through a lot of them, but you can find a lot of good documents there dealing with the trail there at the Federal Writers Project. And really, there's no end to that. Whatever you're interested in, you can find stuff there. I got interested, even though it's not into my subject matter, they had a bunch of slave narratives where they interviewed people who were slaves. The unfortunate side of that is that by the time they're doing this, you're dealing with people who were in their 70s or 80s. So those that were slaves as children. So sometimes their memories are going to be different as children than as adults. But still, that's just fascinating to get the real words from the real people. So from just, I was just put in Oregon Trail in that last web page there, and just James Meikle Sharp showed up. So here's a document just that fast. I was able to find an Oregon Trail document from 1852 from the federal government. There's dozens of other places. I used to use internet archive.org, the Internet Archive. 15 years ago, it was pretty much just documents and it was easy to search. Now there's a whole bunch of other data. I don't use this very much anymore. It's harder to use, but they do have a lot of old documents. But newspaper databases, you talked about them before. A lot of state and local museums have a lot of documents online. History Nebraska, we have a lot of stuff online. Local museums do as well. Oregon California Trails Association has several hundred documents from the trails online that you can download. Library of Congress, we already talked about. A good way to start searching is to find bibliographies for what you're doing. If you're doing genealogy for your family, I'm not sure that a lot of these bibliographies are going to help you, but for things like the trail, cowboys, Native Americans, African Americans, there's a lot of wonderful bibliographies out there that are pre-digestions of learning that will get you started with what things to look up. And then you can search for those things online or sometimes interlibrary alone. But very often bibliographies will just have published documents. But another good source that's takes more time to go through is Western Americana book catalogs, because sometimes they'll have documents that aren't published. So that's a good way to go. And universities that have good Western collections like Yale or Denver Library will have they might not have their documents online, but they've got a catalog online that will let you know what they've got in their collections. So then you can write and get a copy that way. A good bibliography for the trail is Platte River Road Narratives by Merrill Mattis. He's got about 2,000 primary documents. And where to get them. California Gold Rush, Gary Carruth's, wonderful as well. This deals with the entire West, but Plains and Rockies. The first one is in the 1920s and then redone like 4 times. So this has oodles of stuff dealing with travel. This is throughout the Western trails. So this is going to deal with about everybody. But these bibliographies are wonderful to read because that will give you clues as to what books you want to get for your library or for your research. But local places too will very often put on places. I was very happy to find the Museum of the City of San Francisco put on Alvin Coffey's primary document. Alvin Coffey was the only African American in the Society of California Pioneers. You can find the Society of California Pioneers documents online. Also, the Oregon Pioneer Association too. But Alvin Coffey went west as a slave. The person who owned him took him to California to help work in the mines. The promise was that he was to work in the mines, but that he would able to save up money and buy his freedom. Well, it didn't work out that way because the person that owned him then took him back home, did not follow through on his promise. Alvin was then sold to another person who again went to California. This time Alvin was able to save money and actually bought his freedom and the freedom of his family. And then they all moved to California. His document has some poignant things too. This is close to California here. An ox had given out and was down and was not able to give up. About 100 yards from the spring. After a while it got dark. The ox commenced bawling pitifully. Some of the boys had gone to bed. I said, let us go out and kill the ox, for it is too bad to hear him bawl. The wolves were eating him alive. None would go with me, so I got 2 double-barreled shotguns which were loaded. I went out to where he was. The wolves were not in sight, although I could hear them. I put one of the guns about 5 or 6 inches from the ox's head and killed him with the first shot. The wolves never tackled me. I had reserved 3 shots in case they should. I think this story is amazing. Some things I learned from this story is that here's a person who was going west as a slave. In the West, I'm not saying things were better. Often they were worse. But something that happened about the American West is that very often the rules changed or were rewritten or sometimes were in flux. So here's a man who was a slave, but yet he took a shotgun out in the dark, put an ox out of his misery. So as gruesome as this story is, this tells me that what's going on with the party he was in is not like we normally experience, maybe a slave experience in Mississippi or Alabama, that the world is going to be different out here in the West. I'm not saying better. I'm just going to say that very often the rules are sometimes in flux out here in the West. And so even though gruesome the story is, it still teaches me a lot about people that were involved in the trail experience out here. But Alvin he did go out to California a second time. This time he's able to save money and he was able to purchase his family's freedom and return to California and lived in California the rest of his life. We're also very lucky to have his image, his likeness survive. Like I said, he's the only African-American member of the Society of California Pioneers. So I think it's a wonderful gift to be able to know his story. Very often we don't get the stories of African Americans involved in this history. And there were African Americans throughout the Western experience. A lot has been written about the Buffalo Soldiers of post-Civil War, but forgetting that for 300 years, African Americans were involved in the story of the American West. And found his obituary online. And so anyway, that's pretty much the talk I've got. We got about 7 minutes left, so we can ask for a few more questions, but I'm going to conclude here with my slide program. So how do you think this story should end? We've talked about the trail, talked about people on the trail, talked about people dying, talked about people living. I showed you landmarks on the trail. So how should we end this story here with the slideshow? Well, and that's my slideshow.
Well, now, after seeing your presentation, I can understand why you call it a living history. Wow, that was really powerful. Well, I'll open up the floor. I've got a few questions, but before I ask my questions, let me open up the floor to the students. Any questions?
Hello, this is Wendy, and I actually lived in a town called Redland, Oregon, which is just outside of Oregon City. So what they call the end of the Oregon Trail. Have you ever been to that museum? Or
I have been to that
City?
museum and saw Chimney Rock there.
Chimney Rock in Oregon?
Well, the joke there was that everywhere I go on the Oregon Trail, every museum, there's an image of Chimney Rock there somewhere.
Probably one picture's in there. So what we've learned about the end of the Oregon Trail is there's the museum, and what it has two Calistoga wagons, and it has metal that goes up and over, makes these huge arches. And at what point in time they used to have canvas on those, but it deteriorated. But in that area, it's a flat. It's right off of the Willamette River. Is that the Willamette? The Clackamas River. And so it was really close to the Clackamas River. And there was an area in the field that whole area was a big field, and that's where people would park when they got to the end of the Oregon Trail, and kind of wait to figure where they were going to go. But now there's a Home Depot and a bunch of different buildings now. But
they should have waited for the Home Depot.
Yeah, but I guess my understanding is that you had to go if you were going to register any land in Washington and Oregon. You had to go to Oregon City to register at the land office, and that's like we have the McLaughlin House there. So, and then not very far to the north on the other side of the Columbia River is the what's the outpost? The Trapper Outpost. John McLaughlin's the fur traders is right up there too. So it's very close.
I'm not up on land acquisition there. That was before the Homestead Act came about that greatly affected Kansas and Nebraska and other parts west.
Right.
But they were somehow acquiring the land through purchase. John McLaughlin was helping a lot of people get started, even though he was a British agent.
Yeah.
People, they ended up in these places. And when we do our documentaries and when we do our TV movies, the people get to Oregon, they get to California, and everybody's happy, forgetting that you're getting to Oregon, it might be November, and you still have to survive the winter, and you might not have any food with you. Sometimes people, a fellow by the name of E.B. had family there already and was able to get help from their family and survive the winter. Sometimes they had friends, but sometimes they were really, really destitute when they would get to these places. And there's a lot of story there too that's sometimes lost in the big picture of the Oregon Trail. That story is going to be important to people locally, but for some reason it's not in our big picture. But you get there, you've run out of food. Charles Frederick True went to California, and they stumbled into Sacramento with just one cow left and pulling a small cart. And they were totally destitute and had to depend upon the goodwill and assistance of others. The first people going to California in the 1840s, California was still Mexican territory until 48. Oregon had joint occupancy or joint ownership between United States and England. But there's a whole big story there too.
Yeah, and you know, there is. It's a huge ending, and there's also when you come into, okay, so you're coming from the east, and you know there were multiple ways to get into Oregon City when they settled in Oregon, you know, at the end of the Oregon Trail, and I actually had a client. His name was Kurt Tigard, and if you ever look up the city called Tigard, Oregon, it was a train stop and it used to be called Tigardville, but now it's just Tigard, Oregon. And he has memoirs that when I was working with him, that his grandparents, when they came over, about having to choose to go down. You could float down the river, down the Columbia River, and that was before they had any of the falls and dams, so it was very dangerous. You could take the overland trail down, you know, up over the mountain passes, the Cascades. And then there was also a trail called the Barlow Trail. And the Barlow Trail was actually a toll. So they opened the Barlow Trail and you had to pay a toll, but hopefully it was where, you know, it wasn't going to take you as long. But there was a lot of stuff coming up when those wagon trains were coming over the passes. On the way up over the Mount Cascades, there's places like where rocks where they would lower the Calistogas down, and they'd lower them down these hills. I mean, and they were super steep hills. I mean, when you drive your car over the Cascade Mountains, it's pretty steep, but these people didn't have a pass. So
Yes, you get to read one diary where they had gotten to the Dalles. They'd gotten to the Dalles around November, but then they still had to go down the Columbia River, and it's November and it's cold, and they had someone die in the river. So technically they're in Oregon, but they still have a lot of life risking things to do. Just the last bit there.
Right. Well, and then they had to decide if they were going to become a British colony or if they were going to, you know, at Champouie Park in Oregon. You know, and those, I'm sure there was a lot of those settlers, but it was very interesting. My client, Kurt Tigard, his story about his grandparents coming over and settling and, you know, how much it cost. I mean, like you did say, it cost a fortune for people to buy anything. But the Willamette Valley is great now. Lots of farmers, lots of very industrious. So thank you for your share.
Yeah, I used to live in Oregon too, and we're at the terminus of the Applegate Trail. So where did the Applegate Trail start?
Applegate Trail is, I'm not familiar with it. That's a local trail. Oh, Applegate, is that the one that going from California to Oregon?
Well, that's why I was wondering where it started. I lived in Medford, Oregon.
Yeah, no, I'm familiar with that, but there was, and that's not part of my world here, so I don't know much about it. But there is north-south travel there in Oregon and California. A lot of people would go to Oregon in the 40s, and then they went south to California for the gold rush too, and vice versa too. I went to California and heard there was better farmland in Oregon.
Okay, and then another, it's a silly question. My great-grandfather came across the country from Maine to Butte County, where he worked in the gold fields, but he probably had to go on the Oregon Trail, didn't he?
Yes.
Is there any way to trace who those people were? I'm sure that it wasn't like a ship where you have a passenger list. So
well, I'm glad you said ship, because that's another thing too. As far as people going to the gold rush, there's a couple of different ways. Now, I talked about earlier about how fantastic the Great Platte River Road was, and it was. But there was also southern routes to California as well.
Oh, okay.
And very often I'm finding demographically, you know, the people I'm dealing with that are going on the Oregon Trail across Nebraska on the Platte River Road, there's a lot of people from Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, New York, Maine, Rhode Island, a lot of people that are from Alabama and Florida and Georgia going to California Gold Rush. A lot of them are taking the southern route across Arizona and New Mexico. And
Yeah.
so I'm
You,
not.
you don't sign up to go on a trail, you just go.
You
So
just,
there's
yeah,
no,
you decide what way you want to go, and sometimes you change your mind mid-route, but you decide what way you want to go. Also, huge numbers of people, more people probably went to the gold rush across the Isthmus of Panama or across Nicaragua, and then up the.
yeah, my great grandmother did that to meet my great grandfather. She came from Maine once he'd gotten established in Butte County, and she rode a donkey and
Huge numbers of people that ended up in Utah actually came from California. So for
oh,
years,
that's crazy.
you'd hear the word Mormon Trail. So everybody talked about, going across the plains to Utah, forgetting that thousands and thousands and thousands of people were pioneers to Utah, but came from California. So now that database, the Mormon Pioneer database that I showed you before, now they include those people that went from California to Utah, because that's every bit of a fun story. It's just, I don't have those stories here with me. I collected.
Anyway, he got across the country, that cross country, and she got around the Isthmus of Panama, and they became my great grandparents.
And
Thank you.
even then, people that might be related, there might be someone that went overland to California for the gold rush, sent money back home to bring his family, and they might have went by boat.
So real quick comment and a question, real easy question. There's an Oregon California Trail Association, I'm sure you know of, but for the people here in Reno, there is a sub chapter in Reno. And if you want to go out and help Mark and restore and research it, you can join that, and they'll be happy to have you. My question is, my first Duncan appears in California in the July 1850 census. Like I say, they came up the Cherokee Trail. Do you think he would have come in 1850? Or possibly in 1849 to get there in July?
I don't know, but I'm thinking if it was the 1850 census, he probably would have been there before.
Okay, that's what I was thinking.
I've
Early
not,
July, possibly he would have had to come.
I would just say, and I'm making this answer up, I would just think that if it's the 1850 census, he probably wouldn't have been established to where someone could count him.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions for the class?
Yes, I have one, if I may.
Oh, go ahead, Virginia.
Okay, Loren, by the way, hi from South Dakota.
We're in South Dakota.
I'm in Pierre.
I've been to Pierre.
Yep. Yeah. I met your father when he was working with Game Fish and Parks way back when. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, my question is, I've been doing a lot of research with some of the people on the Oregon Trail. I don't have ancestors, but one of my ancestors was actually a trail driver, if you want to call him that. He worked with the fur trade, but William Sublett.
Oh, yes.
And I'm looking for the Sublett cutoff. I've been hearing stories, and I see generalized maps with Sublett cutoff marked. But whenever I go into contemporary maps or anything that I find online, I cannot find it. Do you have any idea where that might be? It's in the southwest part of Wyoming.
That's going to be a pretty huge rabbit hole then. Yeah, you see that on the maps on, well, like I showed you that simplistic map earlier, you're going to see it on a map like that.
Yeah.
Yes, I have not heard of, but that doesn't mean anything. I've not heard of anybody actually getting down and mapping it. That would probably be a very, very hard thing to map, because they're not going to leave as big a trace being a fur trade trail as a wagon road. Wagon roads are leaving trails. I showed you swales before. There's other ways you can tell wagon roads too, even in eastern Nebraska, where the land's been plowed over. Well, farmers could tell where the trail was because their plows would dig harder there. And today with the LDR, I think that's what it's called, that just jumps right out at you. Also, I've been playing a lot with Google Maps, and you can find huge chunks of the Oregon Trail with Google Maps. I had a web page set up, but I took up too much time talking. But you can use Google Maps to see those swales from the air as well. There's lots of places where I know the trail went, but you can't see it from the ground, but from the air you can see it. So huge chunks of it jump out on Google Maps. So you can really use that to find the trail. Also, the early surveyors, you'll very often see them, they'll mark on the map, it'll just be dotted lines and say Old Immigrant Trail. So there's huge chunks of the trail all the way across the country that we can tell where it was because we have the USGS survey maps, we have trail remnants from the swales and other things like that, Ezra Meeker marking it. But for fur trade trails, there were people going in all sorts of places. And I don't know enough about the sublet road to know how many people were on it, but I don't think it was a major wagon road. But you look at trails across Colorado and Utah, and today we look at the main trail, like that fellow challenged my first map, and he's right. But when you start dealing with fur trade traffic, there's huge numbers of trails going everywhere, and they've not been marked. Very few.
Okay, Loren,
Yes.
at the time he was not working fur trade anymore. He was retired. He was one that established the Fort Laramie, used to be called Fort William, in Wyoming.
Yep.
And anyway, left over there when he was no longer working that area. Then he got the wanderlust again, and he started working with all these travelers going along the Oregon Trail. Now, I have seen a photo online. I don't remember off the top of my head the source of it, but it did show the beginning of the Sublet cutoff. And when I checked the resources, it said there was like a 20-mile gravel road to get to that section. The gravel road was part of the Oregon Trail. Then the picture showed the main part of the trail going off to the southwest. And it was, again, a 2-track dirt road, if you can call it a road. But the Sublet cutoff, you could barely see anymore. And mainly because at the time it wasn't used as much. But anyway, kind of keep that on a back brain cell.
Well, that is good information. I'm not familiar at all with the sublet cutoff, so that's why I was sort of speaking about fur trade in general. But when you said 2-track, that's can be very useful. There was a lot of the trail that the people took the trail because that was the path of least resistance. A lot of times then people would then put modern day roads right on top of that. You'll find that in a lot of places, even in Kansas City, State Street that goes north and south. State Street was the trail. People were just using it as a road. They continued to use it. And today it's a modern day road. And the reason that the other things like the Pony Express and Transcontinental Railroad went across Nebraska is because of the Platte River formed this great broad roadway. So there's lots of times here from Chimney Rock to Scotts Bluff, you're going to be within a half mile of the trail, and some places you're going to cross the trail.
Yep. Okay,
So
well, you've given me a couple.
Your 2-track could very well be their trail.
Yeah, you've given me a couple good places to keep searching. Like, for example, survey maps. I've worked with those quite a bit in South Dakota, so I'll start checking those over in Wyoming area, and then of course Google Maps. But we'll keep looking. Thank you.
Virginia, I have a suggestion. Have you looked at William Dollarhide has at least 2 books that he's published on immigration and wagon train trails in America. Have you looked at his books?
I don't recall that one, at least not recently.
Okay, well, if you can stay for the second half of class today, I think we have both of his books, and I can look that up for you.
Okay.
Okay, and any other questions from the class?
So this is Wendy. how many reenactments of the trail have you seen? I mean, I saw the one about Meekers, and we have a lot of Meekers stuff in Oregon.
That's a fun subject. Meeker redid the trail, and he did it in 1905 in wagon. He did it in 1915 by car, and actually flew it in 1924 in an airplane. So he had quite a life in him. There have been lots of other reenactments too. Famous ones recently in 93 was the Oregon Trail Sesquicentennial. In 97, the Mormon Trail Sesquicentennial. In 99, the California Trail. And for each of those, there was a major, a reenactment of people going all the way across. The Oregon Trail in 93 was really, really big. The Mormon one was really, really big. And I got to witness that out here too. But there were also several other ones. When I say it's still alive with us, I'm not just being metaphorical. 2012, a fellow by the name of Rinker Buck took 2 mules, his brother, and a wagon, and went all the way to Oregon. So there's people that are still doing this. There's still people that are biking it and hiking it. People still doing it with animal or foot power still today. A fun thing was, this is a little bit of a trivia, but the last Indian attack on the Oregon Trail was in 1959.
Wow.
You don't believe me, huh? But in 1959, the Oregon Centennial Commission organized a wagon train that went all the way from Independence to Oregon, and they went through here at Chimney Rock. And at Chimney Rock, they hired some Native Americans to come down and attack the wagon train. And there were actually 2 attacks. The first attack, the Native Americans won, and the settlers were defeated. And they attacked again, and this time the settlers won and the Native Americans were defeated. And then they all got together for a big buffalo barbecue.
Yeah. Well, Sue was really great and copied all my family photos and everything. And in that pack, and I was trying to find it, I have pictures of the wagons that were in Oregon that were part of that commemorative. And I don't know if it was 52 but it was in the 50s. Suzanne, 59. Do you remember copying those at all?
Yeah, but I don't remember what year, if the year was identified or not.
Yeah, so if I find those, I'll send them to Sue.
Yeah, what I read, and I lost the guy's name, but a guy wrote a book. He was with this, I forgot his name now, but yeah, it was a published book, 1959. And so I'm very interested in these modern day uses of the trail by either wagon or foot power.
Yeah. And I went to Willamette, I graduated from Willamette University in Salem. And there was a guy that I went to school with, and his Eric Fishback, and his family came across the Oregon Trail. And so he was part of that, I think that 93 event that came across. But I'll see if I can find those photos for you and see if they can help add to you for the Oregon Trail. And just for everybody that doesn't live in the Northwest, we always call it the Oregon Trail. I know it doesn't look right, but that's how I say I'm an Oregonian. So, it's, we say it weird, but it's, the end of the Oregon Trail. And it's a great place. It's a beautiful place in Oregon City. So, but Loren, thank you for your great presentation, and good luck on sharing the story with other people to keep it alive.
Well, thank you. And come out and visit us. I showed you pictures. The trail from California Hill to Guernsey is just a wonderful vacation experience without having to go huge miles. We have good museums, good trail resources, and we'd really like to show off our part of the trail.
Well, before you leave, Loren, I have one, or actually 2 last questions. I know you said that some of the graves were on private property, but is there any kind of an attempt other than putting, the wood fencing around it to actually preserve these graves forever?
Pardon me?
Is there any kind of ongoing work to preserve the graves that are still in existence, even if they're on private property?
Some of those don't really require it. The Amanda Lamb grave, there's just the marker there. The stones are disturbed, so there's not a lot there. Those that are on private property, the A. Kelly grave, there's nobody, there's, people that live there, but they're taking care of that. There's no cattle on there. Susan Hale grave in eastern Nebraska is fenced off. One of a very wonderful place, the John Winslow grave in eastern Nebraska. Last time I was there, the farmer would let people go across his property as long as they closed fences. And that's in a hay field. So the ones that I showed you pictures of are being protected, even though they're on private property.
Is there a one-stop place where you can go and view all of the surviving graves, either online or in a book?
No, I've got pictures of these ones. There's several of them that aren't normally accessible, and I've got pictures of those. You can sometimes find a picture or two of them online. I don't know. The Oregon, California, this is a fun resource. You'll like this. The Oregon California Trails Association that Dave mentioned earlier has a book. They've got 2 editions of it, Graves of the Oregon Trail. And that would really answer your question a great deal there.
Great, that is wonderful. I'll make sure I purchase that for our library. I really appreciate that. Because that's definitely an underrepresented resource in our collection. Okay, well, if there's no other questions from the class, I'll say thank you so much, Loren. This has been an absolutely wonderful presentation. And we definitely appreciate you allowing us to record it, and we'll get it up on our school YouTube channel as soon as I can.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Loren.